June 23, 1941, 11:47 in the morning, somewhere east of Minsk in the sweltering heat of a Belarusian summer. The dust rose in columns so thick that the horizon disappeared. Heinz Guderian stood in the open hatch of his command half-track, field glasses pressed against his weathered face, scanning the tree line 2 kilometers distant. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with birch pollen. Behind him, stretched across 15 kilometers of broken road and trampled wheat fields, the 2nd Panzer Group rolled forward. 400 tanks, perhaps 420 if the morning's repair crews had worked miracles. Their engines created a continuous thunder that made conversation impossible without shouting. Guderian lowered his binoculars. His adjutant was saying something, pointing eastward, but the words were lost in the mechanical roar. Then Guderian saw them. Not a company, not a battalion, an ocean of steel. The Soviet counterattack had begun. Heinz Guderian was 53 years old that summer, a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for this single moment in history. He had written the doctrine, he had trained the crews, he had argued with skeptical generals who thought tanks were merely support weapons for infantry. In Poland, he had proven them wrong. In France, he had shattered an empire in 6 weeks. His methods had rewritten warfare itself. The concentrated thrust, the deep penetration, the encirclement executed at speeds that made traditional defensive lines meaningless. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactic, it was a philosophy of velocity, of paralyzing the enemy's ability to think before he could react. And now, in the vastness of Western Russia, Guderian commanded the largest armored formation ever assembled for a single operational thrust. Army Group Center had smashed through the border defenses in 48 hours. The Stalin line had collapsed. Minsk would fall within days. Moscow lay 300 kilometers ahead, and between here and there, Soviet resistance seemed to be disintegrating into chaos. This was supposed to be the triumph of German military science, the culmination of 20 decades of careful study, doctrinal innovation, and industrial preparation. Every staff officer in the Wehrmacht had studied the maps of Russia and concluded the same thing. Soviet industry was primitive. Soviet leadership was decapitated by Stalin's purges in July 1937. And Soviet doctrine was hopelessly outdated. Intelligence estimates suggested the Red Army possessed perhaps 15,000 tanks, but most were obsolete models, the T-26 light tank with armor that could be penetrated by anti-tank rifles, the BT series with their flimsy Christie suspensions, the multi-turreted monstrosities like the T-35 that broke down more often than they moved. German planners had calculated that Soviet armored forces, while numerous, would shatter upon contact with the Panzer III and Panzer IV, backed by superior tactics and Luftwaffe air superiority. Guderian himself had believed this. He had written in his journal on June 20th, 3 days before the invasion, "We shall be in Smolensk before the leaves fall." His confidence was not arrogance, it was mathematical certainty born from 2 years of unbroken victory. But now, through the haze of dust and heat shimmer, he was watching that certainty dissolve. The first Soviet tank broke through the tree line at 11:52, then another, then 50, then hundreds. They came in waves, without apparent formation, without the careful spacing that German doctrine demanded. They simply appeared, massive shapes emerging from the forests like iron predators, and they kept coming. Guderian's signals officer was shouting into the radio, trying to get an accurate count from forward reconnaissance. The numbers made no sense. The lead elements of the 3rd Panzer Division were reporting contact with enemy armor across a front of 8 kilometers. The 4th Panzer Division, 20 kilometers to the north, was sending similar reports. The radios crackled with confused voices, commanders demanding clarification, requesting air support, reporting tank types that did not match any silhouettes in the intelligence manuals. "Unidentified heavy model, sir. Our 37mm guns are ineffective. Rounds are bouncing. Request immediate support. We are outnumbered approximately 8-1. Fall back to secondary line. Fall back. They're breaking through." Guderian climbed fully out of the hatch, ignoring the danger, needing to see with his own eyes. A Panzer III exploded 400 meters to his left, its turret lifting into the air in a lazy arc before crashing down into the wheat. The Soviet tanks were enormous, far larger than anything in the intelligence reports. Their armor was sloped, deflecting German shells at angles that seemed to defy physics. They fired on the move, their guns booming with a deep authority that spoke of calibers far exceeding German expectations, and behind them more kept coming. The forest was vomiting steel. This was not supposed to happen. This was not in the calculations. To understand what Guderian experienced in that moment, one must understand what the invasion of the Soviet Union represented to the German military establishment. Operation Barbarossa was not merely a campaign, it was the logical conclusion of everything the Wehrmacht had become. Since 1933, the German armed forces had been rebuilt from the humiliating restrictions of Versailles into what many considered the most technically advanced military organization in the world. German tanks were engineering marvels. The Panzer III with its 50mm gun and torsion bar suspension, the Panzer IV with its short 75mm cannon, both equipped with radio communication that allowed unprecedented coordination. German crews trained for 2 years before seeing combat. German officers studied at academies where tactical innovation was not merely encouraged but demanded. The Panzer divisions operated as combined arms formations. Tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and air support welded into a single devastating instrument. Soviet tanks, by contrast, were understood to be crude machines operated by poorly trained peasants, commanded by politically appointed commissars who had purged the competent officers during Stalin's Great Terror of 1938. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the architect of Soviet armored doctrine, had been shot. Thousands of experienced officers had been executed or sent to the Gulag. The Red Army's performance in Finland during the Winter War of 1939-1940 had been catastrophically incompetent. Hundreds of thousands of casualties inflicted by a tiny Finnish force. German intelligence had concluded that the Soviet military was essentially a paper tiger, numerically vast but operationally impotent. The plan for Barbarossa reflected this assumption. 3 army groups would advance on diverging axes: Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group South toward Kiev and the Ukraine, and Army Group Center, Guderian's formation, in a massive double envelopment toward Minsk and then Moscow. The entire campaign was expected to last 8 to 10 weeks. Winter equipment was not issued because the war would be over before autumn. Supply lines were calculated for a depth of 300 kilometers because Soviet resistance would collapse long before German logistics became strained. Guderian had questioned some of these assumptions. He was too experienced a soldier to accept planning without scrutiny, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. Soviet border defenses had indeed collapsed within hours. Entire Soviet armies were being encircled. Prisoners were surrendering by the tens of thousands, many of them apparently relieved to be out of the war. In the first week of Barbarossa, Army Group Center alone had destroyed or captured over 4,000 Soviet tanks. The numbers seemed to confirm everything the intelligence officers had predicted. But now, those same intelligence officers were silent, staring at the radio reports, unable to reconcile the data with their models. The tank Guderian was watching through his binoculars was a KV-1. He did not know its designation yet. That would come later from interrogated prisoners and captured documents, but he could see its essential characteristics. It weighed 45 tons, nearly twice the mass of a Panzer IV. Its armor was 75 millimeters thick on the front glacis, sloped at angles that increased effective thickness to over 90 millimeters. Its gun was a 76.2 millimeter cannon that could penetrate any German tank in service at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. It had been designed in 1939, produced in quantity since 1940, and deployed to frontline units throughout 1941. German intelligence had no record of its existence. Behind the KV-1s came T-34s. These were lighter, faster, more numerous. They weighed 26 tons and mounted the same 76.2 millimeter gun on a platform with sloped armor that rendered German 37 millimeter anti-tank guns almost useless. The T-34's Christie suspension allowed it to traverse terrain that would bog down German tanks. Its wide tracks distributed weight across soft ground. Its diesel engine was less likely to catch fire than German gasoline engines. It could be produced in factories that had been relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, safe from German bombers, and there were thousands of them. Guderian did not know these details yet. What he knew, watching the Soviet counterattack unfold, was that his 400 tanks were facing something closer to 3,000, and many of those 3,000 were superior in armor, firepower, and mobility to anything in his command. The mathematics of warfare are brutal and precise. When attackers face defenders in prepared positions, military doctrine suggests a 3-to-1 advantage is necessary for success. When both forces are mobile, the advantage shifts to whoever can mass force at the decisive point. Guderian's entire career had been built on achieving that decisive concentration, arriving at the critical moment with overwhelming local superiority. Now he faced the inverse, a Soviet force that outnumbered him 7 or 8 to 1, attacking with tanks he could not effectively destroy. His adjutant was shouting, "Sir, 3rd Panzer is requesting permission to withdraw." Guderian said nothing. His mind was performing calculations, weighing options that seemed all equally catastrophic. If he withdrew, he would lose the momentum that was the soul of armored warfare. If he held position, he would be overwhelmed by sheer mass. If he committed his reserves, he would have nothing left for the drive on Smolensk. Every decision led to failure. He had written years ago that the essence of armored command was speed of decision, that hesitation was more dangerous than error. But now, for the first time in his career, Heinz Guderian hesitated. The expectation had been so clear, so mathematically certain. The German soldier of 1941 was the product of a culture that valued precision, discipline, and technical excellence. German industry had been rebuilt on principles of engineering sophistication, every component measured to tolerances of hundredths of a millimeter, every process optimized for efficiency, every weapon tested to destruction and beyond. The Panzer divisions embodied this philosophy. A single Panzer III contained hundreds of hours of skilled labor. The welded armor plates heat-treated for maximum hardness, the Maybach engine calibrated to deliver 300 horsepower, the optical rangefinder ground to optical perfection, the radio equipment manufactured by Telefunken to military specifications. A German tank crew trained for 18 months before entering combat, learning not just how to shoot, but how to maintain their vehicle, how to coordinate with infantry and artillery, how to read terrain and exploit enemy weaknesses. This was warfare as engineering problem, solved through superior design and superior training. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was understood to be a nation of primitive industrialization and brutal repression. Stalin's collectivization had killed millions. The purges had decapitated the officer corps. Soviet factories produced quantity over quality, tanks that broke down, guns that jammed, equipment that failed under stress. Soviet soldiers were peasants given minimal training and driven forward by political commissars with pistols. This was the enemy that had struggled against Finland, that had suffered over 1 million casualties in the first month of Barbarossa, that seemed on the verge of total collapse.
But the tanks kept coming. A Panzer IV commander, a captain named Hans von Luck, would later write in his memoirs about that day. I fired 6 rounds at a single KV-1 from a range of 800 meters. Every shot was a direct hit. I could see the sparks. Not one penetrated. The Soviet tank did not even slow down. It rolled over our anti-tank gun position as if the guns were toys. I watched our 37mm shells bounce off its armor like pebbles. In that moment, I understood that everything we had been told was a lie. Guderian understood it too. The lie was not malicious. It was the lie of assumption, of mirror imaging, of believing that one's own technological sophistication was unique. German intelligence had concluded that Soviet industry could not produce modern tanks because German industry required such precision and skill to produce modern tanks. The assumption was that advanced military hardware demanded advanced industrial culture. The Soviet Union lacked that culture, therefore it could not possess that hardware. But the T-34 was not a product of precision engineering. It was a product of different engineering philosophy. Soviet designers had sacrificed finish for producibility. The T-34's armor plates were roughly welded. Its interior was cramped and crude. Its optics were inferior to German equivalents. But its fundamental design, sloped armor, high-velocity gun, wide tracks, powerful engine, was not merely adequate, it was superior. The T-34 could be produced by workers with minimal training, in factories equipped with basic tools. It could be repaired in field conditions without specialized equipment. It could operate in mud, snow, and dust that would disable more sophisticated German machines. The Germans had optimized for quality. The Soviets had optimized for war. At 14:30, 3 hours into the counterattack, Guderian made his decision. He ordered a tactical withdrawal to prepared positions 12 kilometers west. It was the first time in the campaign that a German armored formation had voluntarily yielded ground. The withdrawal was conducted with characteristic German efficiency, rear guards fighting controlled delays, artillery laying suppressive fire, units leapfrogging backward in coordinated bounds. But it was still a withdrawal, still a retreat. The Soviet attack did not pursue with the relentless efficiency that German doctrine would have demanded. Soviet coordination was poor. Tanks advanced without infantry support. Supplies failed to reach forward units. Command and control collapsed into chaos. Many of the Soviet tanks ran out of fuel within 20 kilometers. Others broke down from mechanical failures.
The Soviet counterattack, despite its numerical superiority, did not achieve a breakthrough. By June 25th, it had effectively stalled. German after-action reports would emphasize this failure. Soviet losses in the counterattack exceeded 2,000 tanks. Many were abandoned intact, out of fuel or ammunition. The tactical outcome was, by any objective measure, a German defensive success. The Soviet mechanized corps had been shattered. Army Group Center resumed its advance toward Smolensk within 72 hours. But Guderian knew the truth. He had looked into the face of Soviet industrial capacity and seen something that terrified him more than any tactical defeat: the capacity for regeneration. Those 3,000 tanks had appeared in a single counterattack against a single Panzer group. They had been destroyed, yes, but how many more were being produced? How many more were already en route to the front? How deep were Soviet reserves? He wrote in his journal that night, "We have not been fighting the Soviet Union. We have been fighting a shadow of the Soviet Union. The real enemy has only now revealed itself." The symbolic object that would come to define this realization was not grand or dramatic. It was a simple thing, a production tally. In July 1941, Soviet factories produced 1,500 tanks. In August, they produced 2,000. In September, despite the loss of vast territories and industrial centers, Soviet production increased to 2,400 tanks per month. German production, by contrast, remained static at approximately 300 tanks per month. The mathematics were simple and merciless. For every German tank produced, the Soviet Union was producing 8. This disparity was not merely numerical, it was philosophical. German tank production required specialized facilities, skilled workers, and complex supply chains for precision components. Each Panzer III took 5,000 man-hours to produce. Each T-34 took 3,000 man-hours. German production could not be easily expanded because the infrastructure was already operating at capacity. Soviet production could be expanded almost indefinitely because it had been designed for expansion from the beginning. Factories could be disassembled, loaded onto trains, shipped beyond the Urals, and reassembled in new locations within weeks. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, learned their specific task and repeated it with mechanical efficiency. The T-34 was not a marvel of engineering, it was a marvel of industrial strategy. Guderian had built his career on the assumption that technical superiority could compensate for numerical inferiority, that a smaller force with better equipment, better training, and better doctrine could consistently defeat a larger force. Poland and France had proven this assumption. The first weeks of Barbarossa had confirmed it. But now, watching Soviet tanks appear in numbers that defied comprehension, Guderian confronted a different reality. Quality could be overwhelmed by quantity if the quantity was sufficient, and Soviet quantity seemed infinite. His subordinate commanders were asking questions he could not answer. How many tanks do they have? The intelligence estimates said 15,000 at the start of the campaign. German forces had already destroyed or captured over 10,000. Where were these new tanks coming from? How long can they sustain these losses? German doctrine assumed that any military force suffering such catastrophic casualties would collapse. The Soviet military was not collapsing. It was reconstituting faster than it could be destroyed.